Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Outlook. My guest today is the renowned American ecologist and this year's Tyler Prize winner, Dr. Gretchen from Stanford University. Dr. Daly is known for her defining the phase ecosystem services and for contributing to understanding humanity's dependence and impacts on nature. She also founded the Stanford Natural Capital Project, which aims to include the value of nature in political and economic decision-making. Thank you, Dr. Daly, for joining us here on Planet Outlook. It's an absolute pleasure having you on this show tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for the chance to talk with you.
So I want to begin with the ecosystem services. Those of us who work on the environment field, we know a little bit of this, but there's a whole lot of audience who are listening to us this evening. And I just wanted to ask you if you can narrate to them in as simple way as possible, the whole, the phenomenon of ecosystem services.
Absolutely. Basically, if we think about all the different ingredients of our well-being, many of them trace their origin to nature. That all of us, whether we're living in mega cities or far out in rural countryside or mountainous areas, we're all deeply embedded in the web of life, and we depend on nature or living ecosystems for a stream of goods and services that range from things like our basics of food and timber and cotton for clothing, all the way to all sorts of flows of benefits like water supply or air purification services or pollination by little insects of our most nutritious crops. And then through the much more ethereal and less tangible services like provision of mental health, both emotional and cognitive well-being, or provision of cultural or aesthetic or spiritual values. So we could imagine, living up on the moon someday, and but thinking actually we wouldn't last there for more than a few seconds because of the absence of all of these life support benefits, the goods and services that we get from ecosystems.
But how do you then quantify ecosystem services?
Well, that's a really key focus of many people's work today all around the world. And the reason is just that we have not accounted for these benefits in our decision-making in formal ways, certainly not in kind of the modern financial system that now is so globalized and kind of the dynamics of which dictate the future of ecosystems. Then the way we quantify them is by looking at the contribution of these ecosystems to different dimensions of well-being. Some dimensions are quite universal and readily quantified, such as the value of mangrove forests on coastlines or coral reef in protecting people and property from flooding, from offshore storms and even sea level rise. That sort of thing where everyone shares a pretty similar value of wanting protection from flooding is relatively straightforward. Same with water purification for drinking. We can look at how many people would be protected, have improved health as a result of improvements by forest or grassland in purifying water as it flows across maybe a farming landscape where different pesticides or nutrients would come in and potentially cause health problems for people. The more difficult services to quantify are ones I imagine you'll get to, where people have different views as to the value and the sacredness of different elements of nature. And there one can also quantify for example, the different implications of changing a forest ecosystem today for different people. And there are also methods for doing that, but to leave that for later in the conversation. When it comes to these services on which there's widespread agreement, we can look at avoided damages and the value therein, avoided harm to people and the values we attach to that, and start bringing these into decision making. And most of the time, actually, we don't need a monetary valuation to inform better decisions. And that helps avoid some of the concerns over, quote, commodifying nature and decisions.
The Natural Capital project that you founded in Stanford, tell us a bit on that as well.
Yeah, we co-founded it about 15 years ago with two major nonprofits, the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy. And today it's grown greatly and encompasses many, many different partners around the world. So about 300 research and mostly implementing partners. And the idea of the Natural Capital Project is to shine a light on these values of nature, to incorporate these values as best we can in different types of decision making, and to transform the way that the standards we use and the way that our financial and other kind of economic planning and governance systems work, so that we restore and regenerate the vital benefits that go to people in many different places in society around the world. And we've developed, I could go a little bit further, we've worked in about 60 countries directly, including in India and across Asia. We've developed a way of making the science much more accessible and actionable. And that's through a digital platform that lets you play around with different scenarios of the future. So you can look at a map of your place. If you imagine zooming into a satellite type image of your favorite place, you can see the elements of nature there, and also the built and other transformed parts of a landscape or seascape, maybe dominated by human activity like farming or hydropower production or cities, and then play around with changes, decisions that restore more nature in the future, such as in cities, to allow for more physical activity and mental health, being in little parks and in tree-lined streets, more cooling of cities under future climate. Or you can look at scenarios where we have less nature in the future and compare what the impacts would be on people, and basically quantify where and how much benefit comes from nature and to whom, and then try to feed that understanding into decisions about the future development pathway of a place. We also use this to help guide investments by development partners, such as the major development banks, in more inclusive and green growth pathways.
You mentioned 60 countries. You mentioned India. India and some of these 60 countries also have this GDP growth. They project GDP growth. But environmental costs are never accounted in this GDP. So what's your take on this? This year after year, we are projected this growth be 5%, some year maybe 6%. Now in the pandemic, it's come down to 2%. So has this needs to change, or how it should change?
Yeah, this is absolutely a path to ruin, to continue ignoring the values of nature, however we express them, in such a widely adopted standard as GDP in informing decisions. So actually, for many years, people have tried to change GDP. Many Nobel laureate economists have proposed doing so, and various country leaders, such as a former president of France, trying to bring the EU behind this. Never has it succeeded. So at this point, a number of leaders in research and in policy have come together to advance a new metric called gross ecosystem product. And this metric has actually been structured alongside GDP, but it reflects the full suite of benefits that come from nature, the goods and services from ecosystems, just as GDP measures, the flow of goods and services from the economy multiplied by their price. We're attempting to measure the goods and services from ecosystems multiplied by a meaningful measure of their value. And of course, we don't yet have every single one. There's so much complexity in human dependence and also human impacts on nature. But we do have many well-known services and goods from ecosystems captured in GEP. And the idea is to start feeding this GEP metric into decision-making, doing three things. The first is illuminating the benefits of nature to society that we all experience one way, directly or indirectly, one way or another, in all that we consume. Second is to guide financial investments in restoring and regenerating dimensions of nature in cities, in farmland, along coastlines, to help secure societies in terms of climate risks, health risks, and other core dimensions, nutritional security, livelihood security. And third is to track progress, see how we're doing, track the performance of leaders and the policies that they're meant to implement. And this has recently, in March, been approved by the UN Statistical Commission for global deployment. And so the Asian Development Bank is now gearing up to help deploy this across Asia, including in India, to hopefully connect with leaders and policies and drive this transformation that we all urgently need.
But do you, what sort of timeline, because this talk of natural capital and the green economy has been around for some time. Your project is 15 years old, that's quite. And if I go back further, was first mentioned by A.F. Schumacher in his book. It's called what? The small.
Is beautiful, I think. I'm forgetting myself.
But somewhere I think it gets stuck, kind of thing. Do you think the US taking a big leap in this now that you have a new administration?
Okay, you're bringing up some really good points here. Number one is that for anyone tracking what's happening to the planet and to all of us people and our companions, our non-human companions living on it, we are in a crisis situation. We're in a race to prevent really severe disaster. And we're already tasting that, obviously, this year in many forms, through the pandemic, through the horrendous fires that we experienced right around here in California, and through many other impacts, severe flooding and so on. So we need action, and we need it much more rapidly than we've had it over these past decades. Number two, we are seeing a real shift. And it's from probably many forces. Partly it's actually the pandemic. I've experienced many personal losses, and I don't mean in any way to downplay the severity of the pandemic in our lives. But one possible blessing that's coming from the pandemic is an awakening, saying this is the time. We're not This is not a matter of talk for the future. This is a matter of actually doing something dramatically different right now. A third effect is that we have actually gone far from just the basic science, which is what was developing earlier on in economy and economics and ecology. And we have developed many very practical tools and really compelling demonstrations in many, many countries that are building confidence and helping to build the vision and a broader community of actors, leaders that are driving change. I would say those factors are all the most important. But you touch on the US and what a failure this country has been in leading, and in fact, in doing exactly the opposite in our recent political history and in other ways. Over so many decades, we've not been a signatory to key conventions such as the Biodiversity Convention, the Conference of the Parties, 15th Conference of Parties is happening later this year, and the US still is not a formal signatory. Partha Dasgupta, a fabulous Indian economist at Cambridge University, has just put out the incredible review called for by Her Majesty the Treasury and others on the economics of biodiversity, on the values of nature to people. And I feel that together with now Biden getting behind this, here in the US, the situation is still a bit tenuous, unfortunately, but I feel all of this is really building momentum, building awareness, driving a cultural shift, a deeper shift that we all need, and putting forward actual investments that can be made and are being made in many places. And I could describe some of those briefly if you like.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, well, in India, and supported by the World Bank, there have been major reviews now up in the Himalayan regions in Himachal Pradesh and other places of the role of forests in supporting key infrastructure, especially in mountainous areas. It's crucial to maintain forests for water supply, for downstream drinking, for irrigation, and for hydropower generation. The forest is a sponge that soaks up and holds the water from intensive precipitation events and releases it gradually, providing all of those benefits. And this is now an approach that's been adopted across different parts of the Himalayan regions to guide investments in energy infrastructure, road and other transportation infrastructure, and other planning to help support water and energy security under climate change. There's also tremendous work across India and other areas starting to look at the role of trees in cities and also wetlands in places like Chennai to help secure the future in different dimensions, but under climate shifts that are well underway. And then in other regions of the world, there are similar dramatic commitments to restoring forests and other ecosystems along coastlines for these multiple benefits. And the advances being made are in having much more support from major development banks and other financial institutions so that it's more than just a small project, but actually an adoption by countries through new policy that rewards often small communities or more vulnerable people in cities to align our vision of green with also inclusive development, with much more equitable benefits of development to vulnerable people, as well as obviously securing nature for people. So we're seeing in many countries an adoption of GEP. This came up just in the past weeks with India's interest, 6 other countries across Asia raising their hand and aiming to deploy GEP. China has gone far in deploying it so far, and Colombia and other countries in Latin America are also on board with the Inter-American Development Bank supporting implementation. So we're hopeful of gaining greater traction, and the major gulf that remains is really with private financial institutions. So far, it's mostly the more public-facing institutions, the development banks, the central banks of countries that are getting on board with the accounting and setting goals and actually driving investments that improve well-being of people and help secure people and property, and the broader agricultural systems and other things that we depend so vitally on. But we need to make advances together through public-private partnerships with major private financial actors if we're going to achieve what we need to achieve in the coming very few years.
So let me come to the other now part. It seems there is a big divide between ecologists. There are two camps. One, like you, in favor of the natural capital theory, that we need to value ecosystem services to save the environment. Then there is a group which is not agreed. They can't agree that you cannot put a price tag on nature. You are very well aware of the oppositions which have been raised. Even as you mentioned, Partha Dasgupta's report, there is a lot of also opposition for that report, which came in the UK press. George Monbiot has written very critically on that report in The Guardian. And especially also with the indigenous people, because for them, trees, ecosystems, they are kind of God kind of thing. So around the world, not just in India, but in North America, I know in Canada, there are indigenous people who worship trees, who worship nature. And now your interior state is somebody from the indigenous group. Yeah. So how would you address to them that?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I feel very much in my heart and in my spirit a deep and sacred connection to nature. And I feel that human survival on planet Earth depends on widening the number of people and hopefully greatly transforming the cultures in which we live to restore that kind of respect and deep connection to nature in many ways of our thinking, our mindsets, and also the way we practice our lives, the ethics by which we live, and the policies and other pragmatic ways in which we govern the decisions made by our societies. And so at one level, I embrace very much and respect deeply the many views put forth in that line of thinking and practice. At another level, as a scientist, I'm very concerned that we're not changing in the right directions. We're heading very, very rapidly in the wrong directions with respect to protecting nature and our own well-being. And in this crisis, I'm worried about ignoring nature in decision-making, and saying that the value is infinite is almost as good as saying the value is zero when it comes to using and confronting the major decision platforms and frameworks that are dictating the pace and types of changes that we have underway around the world today. So while on the one hand, I feel that we need a deep cultural shift, I also feel that to get there, we need to start bringing values of nature in meaningful ways into decision making. And while incomplete, I do feel that the lower bound values of nature, such as for protecting people for flooding, from flooding, protecting people from certain health risks, from waterborne and other types of disease, for quantifying the role of little insects in pollinating our nutritious crops, that adding those insights into our formal systems for tracking various types of benefits to people. You know, we track other types of benefits, such as of education or of healthcare to people. And in many ways, we're underestimating the full benefit. The benefits of education are so tremendous. And as an educator, I feel there too. I could almost say they're infinite. They affect so many dimensions of a person's life. Having a taste of education and a solid dose of education that allows one to educate oneself with friends and others throughout the course of one's life. So I do see value in even lower bound estimates that I hope don't undercut or undermine Indigenous and other more traditional views. And instead, I hope that we can build ever more closely to work in the realm that we all had in our ancestry, in respecting life and our planet much more deeply. And I do see some hope in that. We have worked the Natural Capital Project with many Indigenous groups and First Nations peoples in different parts of the world, and have developed very fulfilling partnerships and deep friendships. And through that experience have developed ways of approaching this valuation that don't even involve monetary valuation in many cases. And in, for example, a Native American group in the Hawaiian Islands where we've worked, it was a matter of zoning some places as sacred and not open to any negative transformation, but only open for restoration and regeneration. That's one example, but the approaches would take a little longer to explain than we have just now. But we're in good alignment with Native culture and values, and helped bring those into the more mainstream. And I hope in the future, all of these approaches can be interrelated much better as we hopefully drive toward a shift where in the future we are all much more connected to the biosphere and appreciate our interconnections and interdependence as humans with one another as well. And without that, I don't think we have a very good prospect of achieving any vision that we would consider a bright and beautiful future.
A quick last question to you. And you have worked all across the world. Costa Rica was a good success story in this natural capital thing. But when we come to a place like India with its kind of diversity in all forms, in culture, religion, landscapes, you're talking about a mega diverse place with 4 bio hotspots. How hopeful are you? What are the signals that you've got till now?
Well, I'm first of all deeply hopeful for all of us. Second of all, I would say there's a role for all of us in this movement. And in order to drive this hope into reality, we all must find our role and play our role in a way that we embody as a core part of our ethic and our spirit, that we bring to ourselves our own well-being, that we share with our family and our friends, and that we help convey to younger people. and to others, that we build a movement that opens up more and more pathways for bringing these awakenings, these that have long been held by many in society, but that really are being newly awakened in our modern world. It's not really the fault of people living today to see the circumstances in which we're living. We're all so interconnected, and we're all so much a part of a global system that's much, much greater than any one of us really can even fathom. But we have a chance now to put forth a vision for a much more inclusive set of pathways that integrate our close relatives, the many different plants, animals, and microorganisms with whom we're interdependent, to integrate that together with all the different cultures with whom we're interdependent into a new worldview. And I think we also have a chance to bring with us many of the core systems of governance that are useful for informing where and how much to protect, for integrating livelihoods into this vision in the future, and seeing all people in rural and urban livelihoods as having a core role in driving toward this future, and basically holding hands as we find our way out of this crisis. So I'm hopeful that India, with diversity, has in a way more seeds of innovation, more history to draw from culturally, and an experience in many different types of ecosystems and types of livelihoods. And I feel that India can help illuminate the way for India and for many other cultures around the world. And I thank you very much for the chance to talk with you and to...
Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure and honor to hear you. Thank you for your wisdom. Stay safe, and we shall meet sometime in the near future. Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.